All right, welcome. This is Sheleana Aiyana with risingwoman.com, and today I have the lovely Sarah Peyton here with me. Welcome, Sarah.
Oh, so nice to be with you, Shay.
So, Sarah, you have a really unique and diverse background, and I'd love for you to introduce yourself and your work in your own words for all of us.
Sure. Um, I'm a certified trainer of nonviolent communication, and when I started to experience nonviolent communication, it began to change me in ways that I found very surprising. Not at all what I expected. I became more relaxed, and I had a sense of people understanding me in a different way than I'd ever had before. And I said, what the heck is going on? Why is this happening? What are these people doing? And so it was simultaneous with the rise in information that was coming out about relational neuroscience and about how we change each other's brains by understanding each other. And so that took me on a very wonderful and winding road, which has ended up with me traveling all over the world and talking to people exactly about this. How do we move into the space where we're changed by each other? How do we do it when we're parenting? How do we do it in our intimate relationships? How do we do it in healing sessions? And how do we begin to tell the difference between the space in our brains that gets things done but doesn't change anybody or anything, and the space that we move into that actually allows deep change to happen?
Beautiful. Nonviolent communication seems to be a fascinating topic for so many of us, I think, because communication can be one of the biggest challenges, if not the biggest challenges, in all relationships, in marriages and in parenting. So I'd love for you to just explain a little bit more about what nonviolent communication is in really simple terms.
Nonviolent communication, in a way, has become a subset of what I'm teaching about how the brain works, because it allows us to kind of step into being our own relational neuroscientists to discover what's really going on with people. So people can be suddenly upset. Let's take a child. You say, Johnny, let's go get in the car. And he says, no. And you're like, whoa, where did this come from? This is like a very difficult moment for me as a mom. I so want my child to be able to be in a relationship with me, to want to do the things I ask them to do, to be, as we name it in parenting, we call it cooperation, even though really what it means is that our child will do what we ask them to do rather than that there's something mutual happening there. Um, and, uh, and, and so we can find ourselves with that no in a clash. We're like, yes, no, yes. And threats and bribes, and you won't get to watch TV, and I'm not going to let you call your friend, uh, and cajoling. Don't you understand that this family needs you to cooperate? All of these things we'll hear coming out of ourselves. And we very rarely take that breath, that moment, to have a deep and warm curiosity about the no.
Mhm.
I remember once I was babysitting for a little guy and he started to hit me. And I was like expressing, I was like, when you hit me, it hurts. I don't want you to hit me. And then I thought, well, I'm just telling him about myself. I haven't had any curiosity at all about this little guy. And I said to him, did you suddenly start to miss your mom? And he stopped hitting me and we started to play with trucks.
Mm.
I mean, it was like he wasn't a verbal little person. He wasn't telling me that with his words. But when I actually stepped into wondering about him, it changed everything.
Mhm.
And this is something that's like happening all the time. We live in a world where everybody's nervous system, especially with the coronavirus shelter at home experience, everybody's nervous system is getting cranked on, becoming more and more pressurized. So we're all like little pressure cookers running around bumping into each other, and the steam starts to pour out. And it's quite something to begin to have a warm curiosity about the steam. Like, what's the deep need that's fueling this steam pouring out?
Mm.
What's going on for my partner? What's going on for my child?
Mm. Yeah, curiosity, it always goes. curiosity. Um, in all of the work that I have studied over the years in conscious communication and relationship and couples therapy, it seems to be that missing piece that most of us forget to include in our conflicts, is curiosity about what the other's experiencing, and really putting our own needs aside just for a moment to get curious, so that we can both come into harmony rather than having it be a battle, like you say, of yes, no, who's right, who's wrong.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
hmm So tell me more. Right before we started recording, you were telling me a little bit about your work around self compassion and self acceptance, and sort of how your work is quite unique from a lot of the other work out there. You combine a bunch of different modalities.
Um, but the most important things that come, I have three things that come together in my work. One of them is a sense of ancestors, which comes out of constellation work, family constellation work, which was developed in Germany by Bert Hellinger, and which continues to evolve now after his death in a lot of different places all over the world. But there's this sense of us with the constellation work. There's a sense that we are not just single actors
Mhm.
running around. We're actors in a multi-generational Shakespeare play that has things like migration and death and loss and disinheritance, and all of these things have an impact on us, that we're not just in this moment of the clash with our child when our child says no and we say yes. There's much more happening than just the moment of the clash. There's what's happening in terms of ourself and our ancestors, what's happened in our family line, how have our mothers been mothered, and how did they mother us, and how do we mother our children, or father and father and father. Um, so constellations and a sense of being in a larger picture than we often consider is one of the pieces that I work with. The second piece, as we mentioned, is nonviolent communication. This wondering about what are the deep needs that lie beneath the no's or the yeses. And then the relational neuroscience. What is it that relational and cognitive neuroscientists are discovering now with their ability to peer into the human brain with fMRI machines? What are they discovering that can help us, the man on the street, or the woman on the street, or the person on the street, be able to understand ourselves more fully? Which takes us toward this question that you asked, which was about self-warmth,
Mhm.
the difference between self-warmth and self-compassion. So self-compassion, everybody understands, is a very positive thing. It's very good for us. And uh, and the place that I'd like to invite us even more deeply into relationship with ourselves is the movement from self-compassion, which is just like, yes, Sarah, I understand you. You make sense, and I have a compassion for you in your suffering, um, to self-warmth and self-accompaniment, where all of a sudden we're taking a step closer to ourselves, and we're kind of putting an arm around ourselves and going, hey, I like you. You're doing the best you can, and I'm right here for you. And no wonder you're scared, or no wonder you're angry. No wonder you're finding yourself yelling at your kid. Would you like a little acknowledgement of the pressure cooker that all of us are under? That everybody's working hard here. It's like a affection, an entry of affection that's tangible and felt in coming into relationship with ourselves, which then lets us transform both our relationship with ourselves and our relationship with our children and our partners and our household animals. Affection is a remarkable thing.
Mm, I love that. Thank you. So how does this work show up for you in the world? Like when you're working with parents, I'm assuming you work with a lot of parents given your your references.
I work with a lot of parents, and I mostly work with people as people, and then they bring their parenting questions into the people as people uh, work. But when we're thinking specifically about parenting, one of the things that's very supportive is to begin to know the difference between looking at our child with our left hemisphere and
Mm,
looking at our child with our right hemisphere. So the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere are always functioning together. We're not just left hemisphere people, we're not just right hemisphere people. Both are always contributing. Or we might be like really depressed, in which case we've lost the left hemisphere's activity altogether and we can barely move. But that's a kind of an extreme situation. Mostly we're working with both hemispheres. And so we can look through different lenses of the left and the right hemisphere, and it causes us to see the people that we're with or our children in very different ways. So if I'm looking at my child through my left hemisphere, I'm looking at my child as a function. They're supposed to do things. They're supposed to obey. They're supposed to cooperate. They're supposed to do their homework. They're supposed to listen. When I say it's time to go to bed, they're supposed to start moving towards bed. There's a lot of supposed to's in the world of the left hemisphere, and a lot of to-do lists, because the left hemisphere likes to get things done.
Mm-hmm.
It loves to check things off the to-do list. And so we can look at our child in that way, as an endless series of to-do list tasks. This, not surprisingly, does not contribute to deep relationship and connection. The other way that we get to look at our child is we get to look at our child through the lens of the right hemisphere. Now, there's some trickiness about looking through the lens of the right hemisphere. So first I'll describe what it's like to look through that lens, and then I'll describe a little bit about why it's tricky.
Okay.
When we look at our child through the right hemisphere lens, we're acknowledging our child's infinite self. We're looking at our child with a sense of wonder and delight. What is this? What is it like to be this child? What is this child exploring? What are they in the middle of? What are they discovering? What's important to them? Are they a child that loves animals? Are they a child that loves people? Are they a child that loves Legos? Are they a child that loves paints? What are the things that the child loves? How do they see the world? What lights them up? When we go for a walk, are they more interested in bugs or clouds? Are they more interested in talking about Aunt Betty? Are they more interested in what is the train schedule? Every child has their own particular way of being and their own particular things that excite them, engage them, light them up. And when we're in that place of being delighted by our child, we are in our right hemisphere.
Mm-hmm.
And surprisingly, this does contribute to relational connection. And the more that there is this right hemisphere to right hemisphere glue of mutual enjoyment and delight and wonder and exploration and warm curiosity, the more the left hemisphere stuff goes well. And the less glue there is, the worse the left hemisphere stuff goes. So the more warm curiosity there is in that moment of no, then we're going to go, wow, that's a big no. Why is it such a big no? What are you doing? What's keeping you from getting in the car? It's a very different question than, or a different response than yes.
Mm-hmm.
And so the warm curiosity is something that helps us be with one another, and the warm curiosity in the moments of difficulty lets us go deeper.
Mm.
The question that I love the most is, am I understanding you? Yeah.
Mm. Always feels good when somebody asks that question, and it also that question also invites us to be more clear, which, for a child, they're still learning how to express their feelings. They're still learning what those feelings even are, probably feeling a million things at once. But as adults, when we're asking each other that question, it's really an invite to go within and think about, what is this really about for me? Because I think sometimes we're so busy reacting that we're not actually even clear, what is that need that I have? And that's why we're not expressing it directly, we're acting out. And so in a sense, our inner children are just reacting constantly to each other. So I can imagine that your work sort of just does translate to everyone in almost the same way a little bit, doesn't it?
Yes, very much so.
Mhm,
Because of course we can have that one curiosity with kids. We can have it with grandparents.
mhm,
We can have it with our companion animals.
mhm,
My dog has been very nervous since the whole coronavirus house uh, shelter at home experience has begun, and and I do better when I have a warm curiosity about her upset rather than just annoyance at
mhm,
her for being traumatized and scared and anxious.
mhm,
So so there are both internal attitudinal changes that this work brings about, and there are also discoveries, interpersonal discoveries that are external that this work brings about.
mhm.
And I was going to talk to you, but I would love it. What are you going to say? I'm very interested.
Well, I was curious to actually hear a little bit more about what that work really looks like and how people might experience it. But I'm feel free to go with the train that you were on, and then we
Oh,
can come back
yes,
to.
okay. I'll come back to that. It sounds like such a beautiful thing that we would see our children with warm curiosity. Why don't we do it all the time? And the answer is that the right hemisphere is not an easy place to be. The right hemisphere is the hemisphere that holds our felt sense autobiography. So as soon as we begin to invite ourselves to shift into the right hemisphere, we're also inviting ourselves into our own trauma landmine fields.
Mhm,
And these landmine fields can be extraordinarily difficult to negotiate.
mhm,
And this is why much of the world stays to the left. Let's steer to the left. Let's stay on the left side of the road, because if we stay over here in the left lane, we're not going to run into the trauma memories.
mhm,
For me, being home, and this kind of comes around and answers your question, what does this work look like? I'll give you a little sense about what yesterday was like for me. Um, uh, we have a factual memory of our past, and we have a felt sense memory of our past. So if you remember the street that you lived on when you were in fifth grade, if you remember what that address was, how many floors the house had, where your bedroom was, if you were a person who lived in a house, or if you were in an apartment, where your apartment was, or if you didn't get to have a house, where was your family, where were you located in fifth grade, just like tracking details is the left hemisphere. But the right hemisphere holds a felt sense of what it was like to be in fifth grade.
mhm,
Did we have anyone accompanying us? Was it lonely? Was it scary? Were our parents doing okay? Were they suffering from addiction, mental illness, from trauma? What was the atmosphere of the house like?
mhm,
How did that impact us? So then we have a factual memory of home, or of family, or of circumstances, and we have a felt sense lived memory of home or family or circumstances. And so if we steer to the left with our little car of life and we stay over in factual memory, we don't have to touch the felt sense memory.
yeah,
But the felt sense memory is still there. And the more, like, the less we have access to our regular coping strategies, the more the right hemisphere is going to kind of extrude into consciousness. So yesterday, I had been tracking for several days that my default mode network, which is the automatic voice of the brain, had been tracking that it was very obsessive,
mhm,
and it was making people wrong. It was obsessing about my child. It was obsessing about my husband. It was obsessing about my little dog. It was like just in this blame, rumination, upset. Nobody was doing anything right. Everybody was wrong. I was wrong. I had failed them all. I'm sure that is this familiar to you, this particular?
yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Shay, for not leaving me alone there. and and so I was like, this is so intense. I need some help. And I reached out to some friends, and they came together in a Zoom circle with me. And each of them took a different aspect of what was happening for me. So one of them was me, and one of them was my default mode network. And
Mm.
they just kind of stepped into that with a sense not of trying to fix me, but of accompanying me. And each of them said something that really resonated for me. And I was like, I feel accompanied. I don't feel alone, so alone with this punishing and ruminating voice in my head. And after we got off the call, what began to come for me was the extent to which my felt sense of home, being being unable to leave my home is very much like my childhood. I grew up rurally without we didn't have my father would take the car in the morning. The only way I left the house was on the school bus, came back on the school bus. There was no wandering out into the world to go to the bookstore or the library, or it was like a home world, which had some facets to it which were difficult, and that's in the felt sense memory. But what was actually coming yesterday was a terrible homesickness.
Mm.
Yes, for the smells, the ground, the earth in that area where I grew up, what the berries smelled like, the snow. So many things were just pouring in that were a part of the felt sense of home. And this is what I mean by the almost extrusion from the inside to the outside of what's coming. And I had another friend I was working with just this morning, and this friend was having another kind of felt sense of home, being coming up into their consciousness. They felt so ashamed of their childhood home. And everything in the home that they live in now was felt shaming also. So it was like a cumulative depression and shame that was being awakened because they couldn't leave their house.
Mhm.
And that was a different kind of felt sense from childhood coming up and out. And when we got to hold the shame and the rage together, then their body started to calm. And they were like, oh, things are lighter. I can keep going. Because they had been accompanied and had a sense of being understood.
Mhm.
And these are the two things that are so important in this word resonance. And my book is called Your Resonant Self, and it's all about all of the brain systems and how to be in a resonant space with ourselves and with others. But with resonance, we have a combination of warmth and precision. We have a combination of both affection and a clear and precise understanding that lets the other person's body or our own body, if we're doing it with ourselves, move in more and more into relaxation. And let me take you into the brain for just a moment, if that's okay.
Oh, great.
In the brain, we have in the core of the brain, so if this were the brain in the palm of your hand, and you peeked inside the brain, there's a central core of the brain called the limbic system.
Mm.
And in the right hemisphere, the right amygdala holds the felt sense of home that we've been talking about. So it can get very upset without knowing why. So here's this felt sense of home bubbling, bubbling, bubbling in here. And in order for it to be processed, it has to reach the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex has neurons that nestle and hold the amygdala. But the less we've been understood with warmth and precision in our lives, the fewer neural connections there are between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala.
Mm.
So part of what we're doing is we're growing and nourishing these neurons. Happily for us, these are the neurons that grow the best throughout our lives till we're 97 and dying. They still are growing the best of all the neurons in our brain. This is why we often think about age and wisdom coming together, because these neurons are wisdom neurons.
Mm.
And so the more we have those neurons, the more we're saying to ourselves all the time, of course you make sense. But the less that we've been accompanied, the fewer connections there are there. And the more the amygdala carries emotional experience, and the prefrontal cortex is going, I don't know why the heck you're so upset, Sarah. That's the moment when I said I need help, right? I need more people than myself to understand this because I'm not getting it. Because my neurons, I've been growing with great care over a number of years, and they're still not quite as, they don't catch everything all by themselves.
Mhm.
So we need community, we need warmth, we need people who are trying to understand us with warmth and precision. So as we bring understanding and warmth to our amygdalas, what happens is that another little organ in the limbic system begins to perk up. So as the amygdala calms, this other little guy in there named the hippocampus starts to go, oh, let's make sense of this.
Mm.
And this other little guy goes, it's homesickness. You're dying of homesickness, Sarah. Or for my friend that I was working with, of course there's shame. Of course there's rage. Because home was, there was a lot to worry about at home. There was a lot that didn't work in the original family home when I was a child. And then there's like this, of course, to the amygdala. The amygdala calms, we make sense to ourselves, and we grow new neurons that help us with the next time around. So this is a step. This work is a stepping into making the brain a good place to live.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. Let's talk about that for a moment, because what comes to my mind is that a lot of us, because of our trauma, our traumatized nervous systems, our nervous systems and our brains have wired for a certain state,
Yes.
to perceive a certain outcome as the most likely outcome. Oftentimes it's not a very pleasurable outcome. A lot of times we could be wired for more fearful states, um, more avoidant states, let's say, where we are maybe even unconsciously blocking out love that's attempting to come toward us because we don't trust it. And I know this for myself as a person who endured a ton of childhood trauma and who really never had a parent, never really learned that it was safe to let others in. My whole journey has been about slowly letting my nervous system know that it's okay to actually stay in one place, that I don't need to run at the first sign of conflict, that it's okay to receive help. So is that sort of the type of mindset or nervous system state that most people are in when they come to this work?
Very much so.
Okay.
Yeah, most people are in both a nervous system state and also in well, they're in a nervous system state like that, or they can also be in a nervous system state of continual kind of reactivity,
Mm.
which is a different kind of attachment. So we just started to talk about attachment, which is wonderful because this is very much about the hemispheres.
Mm-hmm.
So if we have a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere, as we were talking about earlier, the more that we've learned to be in the left hemisphere, the more we've learned this kind of insulation that you grew up with, like keeping ourselves. So it's almost one of the things I like to do is to show this visually. Like for the left hemisphere, a little bit what's happening is that we're creating a insulation between our feelings and our cortex.
Mm.
And it can be a very effective insulation, but it prevents us from feeling other people.
Mm.
And then which is what you've been describing. And then like, how do we begin to go on this journey that you're talking about of gradually beginning to trust and to let people in? Very good question.
Mm.
And a beautiful journey. And then the other side of this journey is if we never got to have any insulation at all, but instead we're very much sort of in relationship with everybody else's nervous system state, so that we're always being upset by what other people are doing, and we feel dependent, and we have a sense of often being abandoned. And so we've got we can have both. We can come to this work from both sides
Mm.
of the ways that we cope with early childhood experiences of not being really accompanied and understood.
Mhm.
And those two ways of being will show up in our parenting, especially under stress,
Mhm.
because 50% of us are securely attached. But here's the secret to that. You wonder, if 50% of us are securely attached, how come it doesn't feel like 50% of us are? Where are these mythical securely attached families? When I'm walking them down the street and I see people upset with their children, I don't think I'm seeing secure attachment. And what the secret is that under stress, secure attachment fades in most often into avoidant attachment.
Mm.
So here we are all under stress in the coronavirus shelter at home experience for the United States. And in this experience, here we are under stress. We're grabbing our insulation and hanging on to it. And we're taking refuge in our to-do lists. And we're taking refuge away from the emotional lives of our families in order to be able to survive emotionally.
Mhm. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
So all of us tend to kind of shift under stress
Mhm.
away from our very best selves.
Mhm.
It's good to acknowledge
Mhm.
that stress is having an impact, and it's very good to be affectionate and warm with ourselves, so that even in even in that, like, even if we've got like a little insulated brain, that we're coming around it, we're going, oh, Sarah, of course you're in your insulated place, let's be warm and affectionate with you. It's like a radical revisioning of what's possible for us as humans, that we get to be affectionate with ourselves no matter what.
It's almost like it's the hardest for us to be affectionate with ourselves than anyone else. I've noticed the inner critic is so strong in so many of us. And even the idea of, in our programs, we have people write love letters to their inner child. And
Oh, beautiful.
a lot of people who say, that was the hardest thing for me because I'm so hard on myself. And I wonder if you could speak to that piece a little bit. What happens when that inner critic is so strong and this process of learning how to be gentle with ourselves again feels really hard?
Um, what's most important for us to understand about our inner critic is that they're always trying to resolve an interpersonal difficulty.
Mm.
We often think of ourselves as lone horsemen, like I have this terrible inner critic voice and I am alone with it, instead of realizing that it comes from a larger system. So if we begin, I was working with, I was very beautiful. I was working with a group of older women, and one of the women was 76. And
Mm.
she said to me, I'm 76 and I have believed that I'm horrible for my whole life.
Mm.
And I said, well, let's look at this interpersonally. What, what benefit do you give your mother by believing that you are horrible?
Mm.
And she said, well, and I do this in the context of what I call unconscious contracts.
Mm.
So you're listening for what is the deep need that you're meeting with a behavior that many people would think was negative or self-sabotaging. I had her say, let's say her name was Anne. I, Anne, solemnly swear to my essential self that I will believe that I am a horrible and worthless person. And then I said, okay, in order to, and she stood there and she thought, in order to, and then she said, I am the eighth child of 8 children born to my mother after my father died. I was born after my father died. And we were so poor. And I was just another mouth to feed. I was just another burden. And if I believe that I'm horrible and worthless, then I take the burden off my mother of my existence.
Mm.
I will believe that I am horrible and worthless in order to make up to my mother for her having had the burden of having given birth to me. And I said, okay, do you like that vow? Do you like that contract? Do you want to keep it? Because I'm imagining your mother is long dead. Yes, her mother was long dead. So she's keeping a contract, an agreement to benefit her mother, even though her mother is gone. We make these agreements in childhood to believe terrible things about ourselves that we're believing in order to be able to be part of a family system. And then what happens if we release it? And I said, do you want to release this contract? And she said, yes. And she said, she released it. She said, I feel so light. I have never felt so light in my entire life. And there's a bit here of this changing of the lens from thinking of ourselves as purely independent, isolated beings who have come up with terrible strategies to be mean to ourselves out of thin air. And then we begin to see, oh, I'm part of a family system. So I was working with somebody the other day who had an experience in their family of not only not mattering, but of being punished when they succeeded, an experience of siblings being jealous of celebration and success. And so it was like this person would step away from themselves. If it were me, I, Sarah, solemnly swear to my essential self to turn away from Sarah when she is successful and to ignore and dismiss her in order to keep her from being so vulnerable to attack and sabotage in the family system, no matter the cost to myself. And then you go, oh, I can feel that in my body. And then you can say, oh, no, I don't need to keep this contract anymore. It's an old contract. It kept me safe for a long time. Thank you, contract, but I release you. And so then people begin to step forward into their own lives without having to carry these original nervous system agreements.
I love that. It
Yeah.
reminds me of one of my legends is Virginia Satir.
Oh, yes.
She did a lot of work long ago in family systems, and
Yeah.
I remember reading one of her therapy textbooks around these unconscious rules that we follow in our family in order to play a very specific role.
Yeah.
Because everybody needs to play a role in the family, and it's all very unspoken, as you say. There isn't this, we don't sit down around a table and decide, okay, well, you're going to be the overfunctioner, I'm going to underfunction, I'm going to placate everybody, I'm going to be the aloof one who just sits in the corner and avoids any emotional interaction. It's just, we just fall into our coping mechanisms. And what I've seen is that is because children are very sensitive, they tend to sort of try to overcompensate for whatever emotional imbalance is going on in the home.
Yeah.
And so then that kind of becomes their lifelong role, so to speak. Could you kind of unwrap that a little?
Yeah. Um, when when we are born, we enter a relationship with whoever is caring for us most consistently. And we actually modify our emotional expression based on what this person can reflect easily. This is the beautiful research of Beatrice Beebe and her laboratory, where they've spent the last 30 years looking at close video of mothers and babies and turning them side by side and looking frame by frame, a 13th of a second at a time, to watch what happens between mother's facial expressions and baby's facial expressions. And what they've discovered is that by the age of 4 months, the baby has completely edited their facial expression to reflect what the mother's easily able to be in relationship with. So babies modify their own life expression based on the culture of their family, and in particular, the culture of their responsive or non-responsive mothers. And this is a part of the very beginning creation of these neurons that say, yes, you make sense. So the more that a child, children's nervous systems feel what a family needs. A child's nervous system, the first child, will feel into what is permitted, what can be reflected, what is needed, what makes my mother happy or my father. And they begin to follow that. Now, the next child comes into a system that's already got 3 functioning members or 2 functioning, however many functioning members. So this child coming in now needs to find a new place to be able to balance the family system. And if we've got an overachiever, then we've got like somebody who's maybe going to feel the emotions of the family. Mm-hmm. Because nobody's feeling the emotions of the family. So here's this other one carrying the emotions, but often carrying them inside, because of course they also have accommodated to what is the family culture for what can be expressed. Mm-hmm. So they may be experiencing being torn apart by emotions that don't even get to reach the surface in the family system. And then we have another child being born into the system. How will this child find a place to be able to exist and balance this family system that already has an overachiever and already has a feeler? What could be done here? Maybe a scapegoat. Maybe now this child can act out in ways that allow the movement of this blocked emotion. So every child is longing to contribute, much like every voice in our head is longing to contribute, and much like our default mode network is trying its hardest to manage us. I was working with somebody the other day who had taken a sense of shame that they were never enough, that they were always ashamed, that they could never be right. And as we were working with it, I said, do you think that you're managing the rage with the shame? That you've shut down the rage entirely, and the way that you manage all of that volcanic energy is by turning it inward and collapsing it into shame. And they sat, and then they sort of, their body straightened a little bit, and they were like, yes, I think I do. And all of a sudden, there was more room to exist as we begin to name these roles that we're carrying, you mentioned, within our families. Mm-hmm. We start to name them, then we can go, oh, I always thought I was that, but in fact, I'm playing a role. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It really hit me when you said that by 4 months, the baby has augmented their facial expressions and their sort of energy to match what their mother can be with. Yeah. And just how deep that really is. That's very it's sad for me to think about, when I think about my own mom and what she was able to be with when I was that age. And I can imagine many of us who heard that were like, oh wow, is that what I've been carrying with me? Is that what I've been holding? And so I love that you are working on such a deep level with people from this place of what contracts we've agreed to unconsciously or what roles we're playing, because it really does start pre-verbal. It starts so young.
So young.
So how would we ever even notice that life could be any other way for us?
Yes, exactly.
How would we know that?
Yeah. And I do think we get, because this, the sweetness of this tract of neurons being our most growable, our most gardenable, our most nourishable neurons, we do get these glimmers, as you mentioned, the journey that you have been on, of gradually getting a glimmer of like, oh, it might be okay to trust. It might be okay to let someone reach out to me and love me. And um, and the sweetness of that. It's like there's a little, life tickles us in these places where we think, that we're static,
Mhm.
but really we are so changed by relationship. And this is my deepest message, is for us to know how much we change ourselves and change others by seeing if we can get into that place of warm curiosity.
Mhm. I love that. Because
Yeah.
relationship really is needed. I hear a quote that we're wounded in relationship and we heal in relationship, right? Which is what you're coming home to, is this idea that even though your deepest hurt and your deepest wounding may have originated by being in relationship, so you might think that the best thing to do is to avoid relationship. But actually, even as you expressed, it's the regrowing and the learning and the healing that happens when we lean into safe relationship and learn how to not just validate ourselves but each other, learn how to
Mhm.
validate each other in our experience. So maybe we could talk a little bit about little baby steps that people can
Mm.
be taking to do that.
A couple of the baby steps that occur to me right away is, one of them is intention. Are we willing to allow ourselves consent and intention? Are we willing to allow ourselves to be loved by humans? Is a very good question. Are we willing to let people in even if they are inconstant? Are we willing to let people in even if sometimes they get angry? Or do we have such high standards for letting people in that we're ending up alone uh, and lonely? Uh, it's a very, very good question. Do we have our own consent to begin to bring love in, even though it's not necessary, even though it's messy, even though somebody sometimes forgets us or isn't punctual, or does or borrows money and doesn't pay it back, um, or goes a month without calling us, or I mean, there's all kinds of things that people do when they're under stress, or not under stress, that may not be exactly what we would wish for if we were creating a Mary Poppins list of what we want for a friend. Um, so that's number one, is, do we have our own consent, and are we willing to have an intention to let love in? Is the very first thing. Because if we don't have our own consent, and if we're not willing, then that's our starting place to work, is to work again with that sweet affection for Sarah, no matter what. Like if she's like, no, I don't want to let people in, then we're like, oh, of course you don't want to let people in. Would you like a little acknowledgement that they haven't been very safe? And this is the second thing, is this practice of acknowledgement, this practice of um, allowing ourselves to make historical sense to ourselves.
Mm.
Like, what happens if we say to ourselves, of course you don't trust people? It's sort of very different. Again, we're moving into this radical self-warmth that doesn't panic, doesn't take our strategies so very seriously, but really sees where they come from and says, yes, they make sense, you know? um, and it can be at many different levels. Like, of course, sometimes I'm very messy. Oh, and then what happens if I say, "Of course you're messy. Do you need acknowledgement that you're exhausted and overwhelmed?" It's so different from saying to ourselves, "Sarah, you stupid idiot. Why are you always so messy?" so, so that the radical step into allowing ourselves to make sense, I think, is the very first baby step
Mm.
that we get to take.
Mm.
And even it might be to the point of, I'm sure I make sense, I don't know how.
Mm.
I'm sure it makes sense that I'm obsessively ruminating with my default mode network constantly and I can't make it stop. I'm sure it makes sense. I don't know how it makes sense, but I bet it does. Even just beginning to take it on faith that we make sense, or that we have vows and unconscious contracts, like the ones that we mentioned already, to believe that we are not good or bad or not enough in order to somehow support our mothers. Once I was working with a vow to be an outsider. And I was like, boy, I think I have a vow to be an outsider. I always feel like I'm on the outside. And I thought, what if I have a contract? I, Sarah, solemnly swear to my essential self that I will always believe that I'm an outsider in order to, and then as I said, in order to, I had this sudden vision of my somewhat goofy parents who really didn't fit in very well.
Mm-hmm.
And if I was outside, they could be inside something. If I was outside, my parents could be inside.
Mm-hmm.
And then I could, of course, let that go because that was a silly child's vow, very sweet, makes a lot of sense, but not necessary for me to see myself always as outside.
Mm-hmm. What's coming up for me is that when we talk about this kind of thing, it's really easy for us to see our own childhood. But then when we start to think about being a parent,
Yeah.
right? So it's totally, it's two layers for a parent because they're seeing themselves in their childhood, but then they're thinking, oh no.
What contracts does my child have with me?
I'm
Yeah.
traumatizing them. And so let's talk to those people for a moment so that we
Yeah.
sort of normalize this because
Yes, yes,
so normal,
yes.
and how we can work with this day to day, not only to be more gentle with ourselves, but start to bring this work into our family system.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the very most reassuring things to know is that as we do our own work, it releases our children. They don't even have to do as much work as we have to do in order to get to wherever it is that they're going. You can imagine this if you just imagine your own mother suddenly listening to this podcast and going, oh, I have a contract. And then you can sort of feel the relaxation in your own body when you imagine your mother letting go of some of the things that she's held on to so tightly. So we do absolutely affect our children with any little bit of work that we do to grow these neurons or to make sense to ourselves. And then the other very good thing to know is that no matter how old our children are, because many of us have like struggled and our children are now in their 20s and we're going, well, what the heck do I do now? They don't even live with me.
Mm-hmm.
But the work that we do calms and transforms us. The other thing to acknowledge is that for those of us with younger children, having younger children is being on the front lines. And it is, I've used a battle metaphor, but we're in a kind of a deep struggle with our own felt sense. Our own felt sense is always in the picture with our children. So the more that we acknowledge it and be responsive to it, to ourselves, and the more that we learn about repair, and repair is such a beautiful thing. Repair is what happens after a parent realizes that they were out of relationship. And children will do repairs too. It's quite sweet to begin to notice. But one of the ways a nonverbal repair that a parent will make is they'll be short and angry and sharp, and then they'll realize that they won't even say that they're sorry, but they'll hold out a hand, a gentle hand to their child, and the child will take their hand, and that's a moment of repair. And it's a nonverbal acknowledgement. And this happens often for us as parents. Verbal acknowledgements are difficult, but will also happen. In a verbal acknowledgement, we might say to our child, Jerry, I have been thinking about what it was like the summer that you were in third grade. And my mom died. And I spent the summer in my bedroom with the door closed and you were completely alone. And I just want to let you know that I remember that and I'm worried about the impact it had on you. And I wonder if there's anything you'd like me to know about that time for you. Now, this is interesting because I've done this. The child then says, it sucked, it was terrible, I was so alone. And I find myself justifying, but I was so depressed and I couldn't be there for you. And then you kind of have to regroup and breathe and then see if you can come back to the child. I want to let you know that I heard how alone you were. And it matters to me that you were that alone. And my heart hurts when I think of you being that alone. Just to come back to right hemisphere language, to acknowledgement, to connection, even after we're stepping into our left hemisphere defensiveness and talking about how we couldn't help it and there were extenuating circumstances. And then we just come back to heart connection.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So there's a little bit for parents as we struggle with these things.
It's very much rooted in the practice of mirroring, is what I'm.
Yeah, mirroring and accompanying.
Mirroring and accompanying. So there's aspect of not just repeating what the person or the child has said, but also empathizing, validating, really getting into the feelings of it. And in order to be able to do that for others, we need to be able to do that for ourselves.
So true.
So it's this daily practice from what I'm hearing of this being with ourselves and being able to slow down and tune into the felt sense, being able to really listen to the feelings and respond to them with empathy and validation rather than, justification or trying to make sense of them, because feelings don't make sense.
Right.
So that we can then, offer that to our child or to our partner.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And letting another option here, along with validation and empathy, is letting people know how they're impacted. Like, how does it impact if you and I have had a break and it's hurt you, if we've had a rupture and it's hurt you, how am I impacted when I hear about how it hurt you?
Mm-hmm.
What happens for me?
Mm-hmm.
It's a very nourishing thing when we know that we affect one another's bodies. Yeah.
I like that. I like the idea of taking the time to ask somebody that question. It really takes a lot of courage, I think, because so many of us have been programmed to either shame spiral or to defend. The courage that it takes to ask somebody, how did that harsh tone that I just used or that behavior that I displayed impact you, and then to really be able to consciously listen and share from the heart how that feels rather than letting our defenses come up and start to push away again. That's really difficult to do. It's very, very vulnerable.
It's true.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. Do you have people journal to do some of this inner work, or is it sort of like a meditative process? I think you do some meditations as well.
Yeah, there are free meditations. There's a whole series of free meditations that my book, Your Resonant Self, circles around, that are available for free on the yourresonantself.com website and also on Insight Timer.
Great.
And then actually Norton has just commissioned book 2, which is a journaling workbook for beginning to discover our unconscious contracts and to put them in the context of the brain and our relational neuroscience knowledge. And that book is to be delivered to them on the 1st of June. And so I'm in a massive writing momentum phase as we speak. And and then that will be available in the next year or so, I think, for people to be able to do work with the first book and then also to work with the unconscious contract material as well.
Beautiful. I can really see us incorporating that workbook into some of our programs because what you're speaking about is so foundational to our healing work. It really can't be ignored. It's so important that we look at some of those unconscious agreements and contracts. And I love that you're making it so accessible. So for those who want to dive into this work, they can read your first book, which is it's Your Resonant Self.
Yes.
And I'll post links to your site and your book and everything in the show notes. So
thank you so much.
And what are some of the other ways for people to work with you if they're feeling really called?
Uh-huh. There are a number of recorded um, webinars that are on the website, and there's also an intro to resonant language on the website, so that you can do it's a 2-for-1 class where you can sign up with a buddy and you can practice it, or you can practice it with a partner or a child. You can practice all the different ways to get into the right hemisphere, to,
Mm,
to get in there and have a little bit of structure to hang on to, instead of just being at the mercy of unprocessed felt sense memory. We need a little scaffolding to be able to move into that resonant space. And then I do monthly webinars about different aspects. So the next one that's coming up, aspects of humanness and neuroscience. The next one that's coming up is on boredom, which
mm.
seems very timely. I was like, I must have had some sort of psychic download.
Chris, you planned that before.
Yes, yes. Long time ago. I planned that last May or something. Yeah.
Channel.
And
Mhm.
and then there's an online retreat that's coming up where people can just totally dive into immersion. And that's on the website, your empathybrain.com.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time today. This was,
Oh, Shay, it's been such a pleasure.
yeah, yeah, I really appreciate your work and I'm looking forward to sharing it more with our audience. This is
Oh,
great.
thank you. And thank you for your work in the world with bringing healing and warmth.
Mm.
Mm.